Jack of diamonds, Jack of clubs.
When The Evil Dead hit screens for the first time in 1981, nobody could have predicted the cultural juggernaut it would turn out to be. With more passion than money, it began as a low-budget horror flick by a young Sam Raimi and then became a cultural icon in the horror genre. In fact, many fans believe it to be one of the best horror franchises of all time. And it's not just all about gore and gags, although there are plenty of those. The Evil Dead truly depicts what happens when absurd creativity meets relentless ambition, and maybe that's exactly why it has a cult fandom. Over the years, we've learned a lot about the behind-the-scenes gossip, the legal battles, the production choices, and the plethora of stupendous on-set tales, and these have only strengthened the appeal of the franchise. Ultimately, the history of The Evil Dead is just as unhinged as the movie itself. In this video, we're going to look at 25 insane, fascinating, and straight-up outrageous facts about the franchise that will make you appreciate or fear it even more. Let's get groovy. That said, before we get into things, we do have a really quick request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origins in Super 8 filming. Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell grew up together and were great friends. They made quite a few Super 8mm film projects together, including Clockwork and It's Murder. For the latter, they had to shoot a scene full of suspense, which was the initial inspiration for them to steer towards horror as a genre, since much of their early work was comedy-based. This led Raimi to watch horror films at drive-in theaters. He finally came up with a proof-of-concept short film called Within the Woods, with which he hoped to finance a full-length project, which would ultimately go on to be The Evil Dead. To be honest, gathering the funds wasn't an easy task by any means, and even though he ultimately managed to get enough for the film, it still wasn't as much as he had hoped to gather. Raimi and Campbell pretty much ended up asking everyone they knew to help finance the film. H.P. Lovecraft inspiration. One simply can't be a fan of horror and not know of H.P. Lovecraft. Sam Raimi, too, was inspired greatly by his works, and when he and Campbell started working on the film, it was titled Book of the Dead. It was supposed to be a better and longer remake of his earlier work, Within the Woods, with higher production values. While Lovecraft shaped his stories around scientists and other generally educated people, Raimi's film is centered around 5 youngsters. The Necronomicon, the Book of the Dead, is bound in human skin, and the pages are written using human blood. The tome in the movie behaves in a classic Lovecraftian manner, since the recital of its text brings an ancient horror to the present day. The book plays a central role in most of the works of the legendary author and is also a key plot point in the Evil Dead films. Filming in a single cabin. Since the budget for The Evil Dead was not a lot, everyone involved in the production had to compromise in certain ways. 13 people in total had to film everything in remote Tennessee. Initially, Raimi's hometown of Royal Oaks in Michigan was to be used for filming, but they shifted to Morristown later. They found a remote cabin far away from most of the residential buildings, and all of them had to stay at that cabin, so one room was shared by several people. Naturally, this was a rather uncomfortable arrangement, and many of the crew members had routine arguments with each other due to the difficulties that came with such dismal living conditions. The filming was extremely rough for obvious reasons, and fans have remarked that it was a miracle that production ever wrapped up with conditions like that. Blood budget? 70,000 gallons used. The 2013 film used a staggering amount of fake blood for the scenes, with the approximate figure being 70,000 gallons, roughly equivalent to 264,978.82 liters. Director Fede Alvarez remarked in an interview that 50,000 gallons of fake blood was used for the final scene alone. The film was also shot mostly in chronological order, as the level of gore and violence got progressively worse with each scene. Shooting them in sequence allowed the crew members to play around with the fake blood as much as they needed to without having to worry about cleaning it up for the next scene. While he has a pretty impressive background in CGI, the main reason Alvarez chose to go with practical effects is that he was extremely impressed by what Sam Raimi had achieved in the first film with a very limited budget. His rendition was sort of a tribute to Raimi, who notably used around 200 to 300 gallons of fake blood for his original film. Shemp's Cola and Fake Shemp. An odd name for a healing item for sure, but did you know there's much more to Shemp's Cola than what we might think of it? The famous comedy troupe, the Three Stooges, once had a member named Shemp Howard, who unfortunately passed away in the 1950s while making the Stooges shorts. The producers, however, demanded that the remaining films had to be finished, and to this end, Shemp was assigned a body double to finish the scenes he hadn't been able to shoot since he had died. What does this have to do with the Evil Dead franchise, you might ask? Well, during the first movie, the actors came and went as and when they finished shooting their scenes, so the possessed Cheryl was actually played by a different actress. This replacement actress was called Fake Shemp by Raimi, which has now become a common term. Stephen King's influence. Stephen King is a huge fan of the franchise, and in fact, he provided a blurb that was used to market the first film after having watched it at the Cannes Film Festival. The blurb called The Evil Dead the most ferociously original horror film of the year. Of course, this was a great help for publicity, especially on a small budget, but King went beyond just promoting it with a blurb. Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi, and Rob Tapert decided to make a sequel to the film following the mixed reactions to their 1985 release Crime Wave, and it was none other than King who advocated on their behalf to producer Dino De Laurentiis, who had a deal with the author to make adaptations of the latter's works. The story behind this is a tale of coincidence and luck. A woman was working on the scheduling team for Campbell, but she was laid off, leading her to move to North Carolina for work, where Dino De Laurentiis was also making movies. She got a part as a crew member for Maximum Overdrive, which was directed by Stephen King. While having a casual conversation with the author, she informed him that she was previously working for the people who were trying to raise funding for Evil Dead 2. King was immediately interested, and when he heard that the filmmakers were having difficulty raising finances, he decided to intervene. He called up De Laurentiis, asking him to produce the film. Ultimately, when the latter met up with Campbell, Raimi, and Tapert, they finalized a deal and had a basic understanding in maybe like half an hour. Now, considering that Raimi and Campbell managed to make the first film with very little on their hands, they probably could have pulled it off with the sequel as well. However, Stephen King's help certainly made things easier. The Cabin's fate. The cabin where the first film was shot, the same one that had 13 crew members living and filming inside, was mainly used as a hunting station when it wasn't rented out to the team. Roughly a year later, it burned to the ground when some trespassers set it on fire, probably as a side effect of reckless partying. However, no one really knows for sure how the cabin burned down. Some people claim that the property owners did it themselves because of the reckless vandalism following the success of the film, while Sam Raimi claimed that he had burned it down because he believed it was truly haunted. Even today, the exact location of the cabin isn't given out to people because of how the area is still vandalized by fans. Evil Dead 2 was shot in Wadesboro, North Carolina, but don't get your hopes up just yet. Unfortunately, the cabin used in this film doesn't exist anymore either. The workshed and other structures were largely neglected for a while, which caused everything to be on the verge of complete collapse. In 2014, the owners of the property allowed a fan named Mike to gather whatever was left of the buildings. Mike had managed to salvage some parts of the cabin and the exterior of the workshed, and he displays them at horror conventions. The shed even has a touring schedule, which you can access at evildeadworkshed.com to know where it will be displayed next. Freddy Krueger's razor glove cameo. If you look close, you can spot a Freddy Krueger reference in Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn. When Ash rushes into the workshed to confront the Deadites, a razor glove is seen hanging on the wall, which belongs to none other than the iconic character from the A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. This glove was part of a mutual understanding between Raimi and Wes Craven, the director of Nightmare on Elm Street. Both of them agreed to reference each other in their respective works. Clearly, the two directors were on very good terms, and keen fans have always looked forward to such crossovers. The unrated release workaround. Evil Dead is undoubtedly a gore fest where almost every frame is so exaggerated with bloody undertones that it's almost amusing after a certain point. The Motion Picture Association of America, or the MPAA, however, could have slapped an X rating on the film. Normally, this is reserved for films with pornographic material, which obviously could have tanked the chances of success for Evil Dead 2 at the box office. The De Laurentiis Entertainment Group sold the rights of the movie to an employee of theirs who was the de facto chair of the Rosebud Releasing Corporation. Rosebud was able to release the film without any rating, which DEG could not have done on its own since it was a signatory member of the MPAA. This loophole allowed the movie to be released in theaters without any unnecessary blacklisting. After learning about this, the filmmakers were asked why an R rating was not given to the film. DEG executive Lawrence Gleason told the Los Angeles Times that they could have forced Raimi to edit some scenes, but that would have made the film around 62 minutes long. Joel Coen edited scenes. Once the filming for the movie was done and dusted, Raimi had a mountain of footage to work with, edit, and format. He had some experience with editing, but most of his earlier work was on a completely different level than Evil Dead, which prompted him to look for some additional assistance as well as expert opinion on how to go about editing all that footage. He decided to use an editing association based out of Detroit, and there he met Edna Paul, who helped him to edit the film. Joel Coen of the Coen brothers was Paul's assistant at the time, who also offered significant help. While it was Paul who edited the majority of the film, the infamous shed sequence was edited by Coen himself. Dead chicken sound effects. During shooting, a number of different kinds of sounds weren't recorded well and ended up sounding extremely weird in the raw footage. Therefore, these effects had to be redone in the editing rooms to give the intended experience to the viewers. The main issue was replicating the sound of mutilated flesh without spending a fortune in the process. To bring this to life, dead chickens were stabbed repeatedly to get the right kind of sound effect that would give an appropriately gory feeling. Bruce Campbell also had to scream into a microphone for several hours to bring out the right kind of fear factor that Raimi was on the lookout for. Connections to the Three Stooges. We already spoke about how the term fake Shemp was coined by Sam Raimi in connection with the Three Stooges. However, that's not where the inspiration ends. The creators of the Evil Dead franchise are ardent fans of the Stooges, and that's quite evident if you take a long, hard look at some of the plot lines in the movies. At Paley Fest in 2015, a fan asked Raimi and Campbell what their favorite Stooges movie was. The latter mentioned that A Plumbing We Will Go is his favorite short, and he even outlined the joke he found the most comedic. It's no coincidence that a version of that joke became part of the plot for one of the movies. In the 1940s short, the iconic trio is forced to disguise themselves as plumbers to avoid the police. Due to the role they embraced, they're tasked with repairing a leak at a rich man's mansion, which they fail in an obviously slapstick way, ultimately destroying the piping system and most of the house. Campbell mentioned his favorite part was when the cook turns on the light bulb in the kitchen, only for it to fill with water and explode. Technically, this was a pretty racist gag, which was sadly consistent with the era. Campbell misremembered what exactly had happened and remarked that Shemp was the victim of the joke, but it was actually his younger brother Curly Howard who had replaced Shemp. Both of the first Evil Dead movies pay homage to the theme and replace water with blood to add to the gore. In the original film, when Ash Williams is trapped in the cellar and the Deadites are roaming around freely, blood starts to drip from the pipework, an electrical outlet, and other weird locations. Then, a hanging light bulb gets slowly filled with blood and explodes, just like the scene in A Plumbing We Will Go. Sam Raimi's car as a franchise icon. In the Evil Dead game, the maps spawn vehicles, which helps the survivors travel very quickly between their objectives. If the player dawdles, then the timer runs down very quickly. One of the cars that can spawn is none other than Ash Williams' car from the movies, an Oldsmobile Delta. While many fans spotted this link between the movies and the game, and good for you if you did, what you might not know is that the car isn't just a simple prop. This is actually Sam Raimi's real-life car. Over the years, it's become an iconic symbol reminiscent of the Evil Dead franchise, especially when Ash uses it to run down a skeleton army in Evil Dead 3: Army of Darkness. The car would later appear in other Raimi films, such as the Spider-Man movies, where it was Uncle Ben in Aunt May's car, The Gift, where it was Annie's car, and Drag Me to Hell, where it was Mrs. Ganush's car. Post-production hell and ad-libbing. For the original Evil Dead film, the crew had to go through a lot to wind up filming in the first place. Due to budget constraints, they didn't have any facilities that most movie sets do and had to improvise and make things happen. Everything was very hands-on, according to the crew members. They were filming during summer and winter, during harsh weather, and had to take care of the spooky effects on their own while being stuffed in a cellar-like structure to ensure that the scenes could be shot properly. The effects of the eerie moving of books and deer head trophies changing their direction were all done by the crew themselves with no special effects. In the scene where the Deadite Henrietta was holding Sarah Neri's hair and spinning around, the actor's costume had torn off in a rather distasteful manner, revealing his underwear. This actor was actually Ted Raimi, the director's brother. While it's not evident in the actual scene because of how tense the environment is, it was still something that the crew looked back on and laughed at. In another scene where Ash grabs an axe and hits a Deadite, striking it to the ground, the crew was under the flooring in the cellar and was pushing the fake body to make it seem like it was convulsing. One of the members even had his hand slotted through an opening in the ground to give the effect that it was a severed arm that was thrashing around after having been cut off from the main body. All of these improvisations made by the crew ensured that the scenes looked passably horrific. Evil Dead video games and comics. The Evil Dead franchise goes beyond movies and TV shows. A video game adaptation of the same name was released in 1984 for the Commodore 64. A trilogy of survival horror games in the late 90s and early 2000s were also released under the titles Evil Dead: Hail to the King, Evil Dead: A Fistful of Boomstick, and Evil Dead: Regeneration. Campbell gave his voice to Ash's character, while Raimi also voiced different characters in the trilogy. Ash Williams would also become the protagonist of a comic book franchise. He would go on to fight both Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger in the Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash series, as well as Herbert West in the Army of Darkness vs. Reanimator. In Marvel's Zombies vs. the Army of Darkness, Ash fought zombie versions of Marvel's superheroes. In Army of Darkness, Ash saves Obama. He also saved the life of a fictionalized Barack Obama. Dark Horse Comics started releasing a 4-part monthly comic book miniseries in January 2008, written by Mark Verheiden and drawn by John Bolton, and this was based on the Evil Dead franchise as well. There was even a stage musical named Evil Dead the Musical, which was produced with the permission of Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi, which had its first show in 2003. It's been running on and off ever since. Finally, Evil Dead the Game was released in 2022. Army of Darkness, Medieval Setting Shift. Army of Darkness is the third installment of the Evil Dead trilogy and the sequel to Evil Dead 2. Unlike the previous movies, Army of Darkness shifts to a medieval setting where Ash Williams is trapped in the past and still battles the undead in his quest to return to the present. He goes back in time after being accidentally transported and is then imprisoned. However, when he kills Deadites, he's hailed as a hero. He realizes that the only way to get back to his time is by using the magical Necronomicon Ex Mortis. The movie didn't do badly at the box office, but many people considered it to be a letdown from the previous two films, particularly due to the change in setting. It became more of a parody than a spectacle, but Raimi's direction and Campbell's acting were praised by almost everyone. There was really no particular reason to have the story set in the year 1300, except that Raimi no longer wanted to use the cabin as a setting. Possessed props and physical FX. The possessed hand in Evil Dead 2 was inspired by Attack of the Helping Hand, 1979, a film Raimi had made earlier with Scott Spiegel. In that short, a housewife was attacked by an evil hamburger helper, which was recreated in Evil Dead. The crew also had to make sure that the blood shown in the movie wasn't always red, because red blood was unanimously considered to be a bad idea when the film went to the ratings board. That's why they had black, yellow, green, and even dark red blood, especially for the non-human executions shown in the movie. Sam Raimi's brother, Ted, played the Deadite, Henrietta, whom we've already spoken about. He had to endure a truly hellish experience with his makeup and costume, which took about 9 hours to get ready for shooting. Ted would sweat so much into the suit that when it was taken off of him, all that perspiration would literally pour out in a really weird and off-putting way. It went to the extent that he lost a lot of weight during filming simply because of how much he was sweating. Some of the Deadites in the film also appear to have no sense of direction and walk around aimlessly as if they're unable to see where they're going. Well, you probably won't be surprised to learn that the actors playing them did not, in fact, know where they were going because the white contacts they were wearing pretty much made them blind. Since the lenses were completely white, there was no hole through which they could even see what was happening around them. To make sure that this wouldn't affect the scene, the actors had to memorize their steps and positions beat by beat without using the lenses, and then recreate that while being virtually blind in character. This obviously led to accidents and mistakes that required the crew members' intervention. Franchise Rises, the 2023 movie. Evil Dead Rises was released in 2023 and quickly garnered a lot of good reviews. On Rotten Tomatoes, 84% of the total 234 reviews are positive, and the average rating is 7.1 out of 10. The movie offered exactly what longtime fans of the franchise wanted to see while making sure to carry on the legacy of the original films. It also became the highest grossing film in the franchise. Keeping in tune with the theme of all Evil Dead movies, even the 2023 release focused more on physical FX than computer-generated visuals. Some of the sets were built on hydraulics to ensure that they would look more genuine in the shots. Initially, the filmmakers wanted Bruce Campbell back in the movie to reprise his legendary role as Ash Williams, but instead he made a tiny cameo. international censorship battles. We already spoke about how the Evil Dead movie managed to evade an X rating in the United States using a loophole, but this didn't work out the same way for the rest of the world. In Malaysia, the 1981 film's release was also censored to an extent. Even in Germany, the film was banned for extremely graphic content, and this was lifted only recently. The most significant censorship was faced in the UK, where the first film was banned for 10 years and termed a video nasty due to the extreme level of gore. As a result, it had to be re-edited for VHS release. Initially, it was cut by 49 seconds, with even more cuts made for the home video version. Now, the British Board of Film Classification, or the BBFC, classifies the film as uncut, considering how newer releases have depicted gore and violence in a more intense manner. In 2021, when this was announced by the BBFC, Bruce Campbell took to Twitter to write a scathing reply to the board, accusing them of being myopic and judgmental. He claimed that it was due to the reluctance of the board to air the film as it was that its popularity soared in the UK and all the restrictions had to be lifted. Ash vs. Evil Dead, the TV breakthrough. Sam Raimi had plans to create a sequel for Army of Darkness, which eventually became the television series Ash vs. Evil Dead. It aired from 2015 to 18. The story followed Ash Williams' life after the events of Army of Darkness, which left him with severe PTSD to the point where he did close to nothing with his life for the next 30 years. He tried to get rid of the Book of the Dead on several occasions, but was consistently unable to do so, and he resorted to becoming its caretaker to ensure that it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. The Raimi brothers weren't sure about the funding for the movie, so they wrote it in the format of a TV show, which obviously came with its own challenges, since Sam had to create new characters and make the show easy for new viewers to understand. Starz was the only network that gave them the ability to be unrated and unrestricted, so they didn't have to worry about censorship. Due to certain legal issues with Universal Studios, the events from Army of Darkness weren't specifically included in the first season of Ash vs. Evil Dead. This was later resolved so that the events were made canon from the second season forward. The Necronomicon's real-life creation. As we've already mentioned, the Necronomicon in Evil Dead was inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's work, even though there are certain differences in how the Book of the Dead is treated in the movies. Lovecraft's version of the manuscript was simply another medieval book lying in a dusty, decrepit library. It was the writing in the book that was the main issue, not the book itself. In Evil Dead, however, the book was said to have been made from human flesh and written in human blood. One of the comics shows that a different human skin was used for every page of the book, and many fans believe that not just any ordinary human would qualify to have their skin and flesh used for the Necronomicon. Different people say that the people whose skin was used were either humans possessed by demons, slaves, or even powerful demons themselves who were baptized by priests. If this theme were to carry over to Lovecraftian lore, then the skin would likely have been Alhazred's own. Ties to Wes Craven and horror canon. Raimi had included a poster of the 1997 film The Hills Have Eyes in the first Evil Dead movie. Similarly, in A Nightmare on Elm Street, when Nancy stays up to watch a movie on TV, she turns on Evil Dead. Freddy Krueger's glove can also be spotted in both Evil Dead 2 and an episode of Ash vs. Evil Dead, which was released much later. A Nightmare on Elm Street isn't the only horror franchise that Evil Dead has ties to. In the 9th installment of the Friday the 13th series, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, several props from the Evil Dead movies are included to connect to Raimi's works. Items like the Book of the Dead and the Kandarian dagger are shown very prominently in Jason Goes to Hell. It appears to be a simple homage to the Evil Dead franchise, but the director of the film, Adam Marcus, made it clear that the connection was not merely surface level. He said that the appearance of the Necronomicon is meant to establish the fact that Jason Voorhees' mother, Pamela, had read from the book so that she could raise her son from the dead. This is what explains why Jason goes from a young boy to an unstoppable killing machine by the events of Friday the 13th, as he has essentially become a deadite. Marcus believes that this is how the events of his film are absolutely considered canon to the Evil Dead universe. Cast and crew cameos. The scene where the evil moves over the pond was filmed when Bruce Campbell pushed Sam Raimi into a dinghy while he himself was handling the camera. The strange wind noises in the film were actually recorded by Raimi himself. He had heard them from his bedroom window while he was trying to sleep and kept getting spooked, so the thought of including it in the film was a split-second decision. Campbell himself played an important part in the production and helped out the crew members whenever there was no scene for him to shoot. When filming had wrapped up in 1980 and most of the crew and actors actress had left, Campbell stayed with Raimi to go over the footage, and they realized that they still needed a few more scenes. 4 days of reshoots were done after that, and Campbell had to endure monster guts being splattered on him. Raimi himself acted as a stand-in when the original actors were busy. The demon POVs in the movies that glides across the ground were actually shot by mounting the camera, with Raimi and Campbell running along holding each side. Richard de Manincourt and Teresa Tilly were members of the Screen Actors Guild, and they could have been penalized for taking part in a non-union production, so they used the stage names Hal Delrich and Sarah York respectively. Franchise influence on modern horror. A lot of people don't know that Peter Jackson is a massive fan of the Evil Dead franchise. Before his Oscar-winning stint on The Lord of the Rings, he made some very gory movies that were very clearly inspired by Evil Dead. Dead Alive and Bad Taste were low-budget films with visceral thrills. Jackson later said that he realized he could make a good movie after watching Evil Dead because he had a 16mm camera, and Evil Dead was made by someone his age with that same camera. A number of other directors who went into horror have credited Sam Raimi as their inspiration for creating their own movies. 0 bad movies claim. While the individual responses to the Evil Dead movies and the TV show have been dynamic, fans agree that it's one of the most consistent franchises of all time, not just limited to the horror genre. Whether it's delivering horror or comedy, the framework that's been followed so far works great and gives results. This could be because the movies are spaced apart, so there's no cash grabs involved, which usually leads to the downfall of most franchises. This is why the Evil Dead series is said to have no bad films from the perspective of critics as well as the box office performances. Marvelous verdict. These aren't the only insane things that happened while filming the movies. In fact, in one instance, the actors took method acting too seriously and decided to smoke marijuana to get into character, which resulted in them having to shoot it all over again later because of how uncontrollable they'd all become after getting high. Actress Betsy Baker was made to cry using onions instead of Visine just because the former was cheaper. Marshmallows, cooked oatmeal, and even mashed up cockroaches were used as physical FX in some of the scenes. Very few movies have such a chaotic film history, and it's obvious that Raimi and Campbell had immense faith in their creative vision. Today, the franchise is basically a household name for horror aficionados, and all of this became possible because of their relentless and borderline obsessive drive to produce a film that they would be proud of. Back in 1980, the filmmakers probably couldn't have imagined the influence their work would have on the genre. In a way, they truly paved the way for many more filmmakers to follow. How many of these facts were you already aware of? Do you know of any fun Evil Dead facts that we missed? Let us know in the comments section down below, and maybe it'll feature in a future Marvelous video. That's the end of our time together. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.